Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with another episode of Moving Mud, which has sort of become my podcast on the last 70 years of history of iron bombing. Now, after the last episode, the second one, we had reached the end of the Second World War, at which point the United States pretty much owned the skies. Over the course of 3.5 years of combat, the United States had developed a particular proficiency for establishing air superiority and then air supremacy, and then using that ownership of the ultimate high ground to control events on the ground by gathering intelligence, degrading industrial capacity, interdicting supplies, disrupting operations, and generally dispatching death and destruction from above. It was actually such a profound experience that it became, and still is, gospel amongst U.S. ground force commanders that air superiority was and is an essential element to successful operations. Yes, in 1945, U.S. air power ruled the skies and the ground beneath them, from the German frontier to Tokyo and most points in between. Yet, 5 years later, in 1950, when war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. Air Force basically lacked any means to counter it directly. It had neither the doctrine, nor the trained pilots, nor even the aircraft to provide direct support to troops on the ground in contact. The Air Force literally had to take planes from its reserve squadrons in the United States and have the Navy deliver them to the combat theater in order to generate any effective ground attack capacity at all. The turnaround is frankly both appalling and fascinating, and essential to understand if we're going to understand anything about the history of iron bombing after the Second World War. Fair warning, even though this is or was supposed to be a series about how we can follow the history of iron bombing by using DCS, this episode is going to be another one with not a whole lot of simulated flying in it. Mostly, that's because there really aren't a whole lot of aircraft to look at in DCS from this period, but it's also because there is a lot going on away from the actual front lines that we really kind of need to understand before we can understand what's going to happen at the sharp end. So bear with me. In this episode, we are going to have to talk about politics. And I don't mean actual political politics, although there is a little bit of that. I mean mostly bureaucratic politics. So to understand what happened that caused the more or less complete collapse of the United States close air support capability between 1945 and 1950, you have to actually go back to the late 1930s in the United States. And then you have to roll forward to 1943 and 1944 in the skies over Germany. And then you have to take a little trip to the Mariana Islands in the winter of 1945. Eventually, you'll need to visit Tokyo in the spring of 1945, and then, of course, you'll need to end your journey in the Japanese city of Hiroshima on the morning of the 6th of August. At the end of the day, the question who killed U.S. close air support, air power, will boil down to two names, Enola and Curtis E. Lemay. Well, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but it sure is a great line, so I couldn't resist. So let's back the minivan up a bit and take this mythical journey that I described just now. As we discussed in the last episode, the United States Army Air Forces had entered World War II with a doctrine that had developed throughout the 1930s by the so-called bomber mafia. According to this doctrine, the Air Force, and particularly the Strategic Bomber Air Force, was the strategic war-winning arm. The Navy and the Army were just there to keep the enemy busy, while air power destroyed their ability and will to resist. And so the Bomber Mafia entered the war in 1942, eager to put this theory to use against Nazi Germany. Except that the experience of fighting the Germans had actually, or should have actually, put some serious dents in that philosophy. Despite more than 3 years of concerted bomber offensive, Germany was not defeated by strategic bombers. Germany was defeated on the ground. The role of strategic bombing had actually been to force the Luftwaffe into combat so that it could be destroyed, granting Allies air supremacy over the battlefield. And so eventually progress had been made in World War II in using air power to support ground operations. By the end of the war, effective doctrine and effective organizations were definitely being developed. Effective purpose-built aircraft, not so much. Effort had been mainly, in the last half of the Second World War, on getting aircraft that were successful to the front lines rather than on developing new aircraft types. If you take a look at it, the new fighter design had really pretty much stopped with the Corsair, the Hellcat, the P-51D, and the latest versions of the P-47 and P-38, which had all really been completed by the end of 1942-ish. All of that is true except for the B-29. And speaking of the B-29, it really was designed by the bomber mafia to double down on bomber mafia doctrine. Having discovered the vulnerability of four-engine bombers to enemy fighters, the bomber mafia decided to build a superweapon that would overcome all of those limitations of the B-17s and B-24s. It would fly high enough that fighters, at least most of them, couldn't reach it. It would fly fast enough that the ones that could reach it couldn't catch it. And it would defend itself with machine guns that were aimed using special gyroscopically stabilized lead computing remote-controlled turrets operated by gunners in a climate-controlled pressurized cabin. It was a weapon system that dwarfed any other development program in World War II except the Manhattan Project. And in the fall of 1944, it was finally ready to unleash on Japan, because the entire production run of the B-29 was destined for Japan. Well, actually, it was destined for Guam, Saipan, and Tinian in the Mariana Islands, from which it would attack Japan. In fact, an entirely new numbered air force had been created just to be the home for the B-29. This was the 20th Air Force. Now, after a brief false start trying to bomb Japan from China in early 1944, the 20th had moved to the Marianas in the fall of 1944, from which it began the task of bringing the Japanese Empire to its knees from the air using precision daylight bombing, a task at which it more or less failed utterly, at least at first. Even with the superweapon, the standard doctrine of high-level daylight precision bombing was simply not delivering the results. In fact, it worked so poorly that the commander of the 20th Air Force, Haywood Hansel, a devoted acolyte of the Gospels of the Bomber Mafia, if there ever was one, by the way, lost his job and was replaced by Curtis E. Lemay, who at the time was already a famous figure because of his hard-nosed approach to running the 8th Air Force in England. He would become even more famous for the results that he achieved with the 20th. When Lemay arrived in the Marianas in early 1945, he rapidly came to the conclusion that the basic bomber mafia doctrine couldn't work, although he wouldn't have put it that way. Oh, he didn't give up on the idea of putting Japan out of the war with heavy bombers. He just gave up on high-altitude, daytime precision bombing to do it. Instead, the 20th Air Force essentially took a page from RAF Bomber Command and switched to nighttime area bombing using incendiary bombs. Of course, being the United States, they took what the RAF had been doing and, well, perfected it, if that's the right word to use here. They did that by using more effective radar to locate the targets in the dark, and by using much bigger bombers with much more effective bombs, because by this time the U.S. had also perfected napalm, which turned out to be a much more effective incendiary compound than anything the British had ever used in Germany. The 20th Air Force unleashed a tidal wave of destruction on Japan's urban areas that is often kind of completely underappreciated because, of course, of what came after. And without dwelling on the topic, here's just a small fact to appreciate. Of the air raids that caused the greatest loss of life on the ground in World War II, the two atomic bombs are number 2 and number 3. Number 1 is the firebombing raid on Tokyo on the 9th of March 1945, which killed somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people in a single raid. The point here being that even before the atomic bomb changed the game completely, there was still a very strong feeling in the USAF that the heavy bomber was a war-winning weapon, and that everything else was just a supporting function. In fact, in the summer of 1945, General Lemay insisted that no invasion of the Japanese home islands was going to be necessary because he was convinced that strategic bombing alone could force the Japanese to surrender. And then, of course, the Enola Gay changed everything with a single bomb dropped on the 6th of August on the city of Hiroshima. And that effectively proved exactly what the bomber mafia had been saying for 20 years. Wars could, and in fact pretty much just had been, won with air power alone. And I mean, while it's hard to completely encapsulate how many things about human civilization were changed irrevocably by the dropping of the atomic bomb, the one small facet that we're going to continue to follow is how that event effectively, utterly undid any progress that had been made on the doctrine of the use of air power for any other purpose than deploying nuclear weapons, at least in the United States. In a stroke, as far as the United States Army Air Force was concerned, we were right back to bombers are the war-winning offensive weapon, and fighters are there to intercept the other guy's bombers. Now, the ascendancy of the bomber mafia was only exacerbated, actually, by the reorganization of the United States military after the Second World War. Now, most people don't realize that the Department of Defense that we see today was actually created after the war. During World War II, there were actually two military departments, the War Department, which owned the Army, and the Department of the Navy that owned, well, the Navy. Prior to World War II, there was actually no mechanism for making these two departments play nice with one another, and that's why the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been invented in 1940 or so. But that was all temporary, and everyone realized that there was no going back. So in 1947, the modern Department of Defense was created, reporting to a single cabinet post, the Secretary of Defense. There were a number of other changes included in the act that created the modern U.S. military, including the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. But the part that we're most interested in is that the act also created the United States Air Force as an independent service equivalent to the Navy and the Army. Now, of course, the folks running the new Air Force were almost entirely drawn from the ranks of the generals who were advocates of strategic bombing, including Karl Spaatz, that had run the bombing campaign against Germany. And so also, of course, the most important part of the Air Force was Strategic Air Command, SAC. And guess who was running SAC? That's right, Curtis E. Lemay. And SAC was, effectively, the living wet dream of a generation of bomber mafia officers, because the centerpiece of SAC, and therefore the Air Force, was something called the B-36 Peacemaker. The B-36 Peacemaker was a bomber with a 162-foot wingspan and a maximum speed of 375 knots and a ceiling of 43,000 feet, at which it had a combat range of almost 4,000 miles. It was basically designed with one purpose in mind, to be able to deliver atomic bombs to just about anywhere on the planet that the U.S. wanted to from bases in the United States or around the world. And of course, Spaatz and Lemay and the other commanders of the U.S. Air Force basically believed that the B-36 and the atomic bomb were war-winning weapons. In fact, they more or less believed that they had just made war obsolete. Unfortunately, they also believed that they had made the other armed services more or less obsolete as well. They certainly believed that they had made the aircraft carrier and naval aviation supplemental to requirements, the result of which was some truly nasty bureaucratic infighting in which the Air Force sought and successfully managed to cancel the construction of new Navy carriers, while the Navy sought to unsuccessfully prove that the B-36 program was massively corrupt and lining the pockets of senior Air Force and Defense Department officials. This whole event became known as the Revolt of the Admirals, and you can actually Google it if you want to know more. For our purposes here, the thing you need to know is that the post-war years saw the creation of the U.S. Air Force. It also saw the creation of a huge amount of bad blood between the Navy and the Air Force, and the virtual emasculation of all air power in the United States other than the Strategic Air Command. To put it in perspective, at the end of World War II, the United States Navy had over 100 aircraft carriers. Now, most of them were escort and light carriers, but they still had 22 fleet carriers. By 1949, they had 5. And one of those was scheduled to be mothballed in 1950. All of which was fine, so long as the United States had a nuclear monopoly. SAC was a big stick that the rest of the world pretty much had to respect. And the threat of SAC really could prevent the U.S. from ever actually having to go to war again, which was all fine until the 29th of August, 1949, when the Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb of its own. With the loss of the atomic monopoly, the whole underpinning of SAC suddenly started to collapse. With another potential nuclear opponent, it wasn't possible any longer to avoid conventional combat simply by threatening the use of nuclear weapons, because the other guy could threaten to use his as well. And the age of the nuclear monopoly was gone, and the age of nuclear deterrence had arrived. And the U.S. military was not ready for it, because they were still busy cashing in the peace dividend and trusting to SAC to end war as we know it. So this then was the situation the United States military found itself in when, on the 25th of June 1950, the Korean People's Army of North Korea, with the sponsorship of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, invaded South Korea, a client of the United States. Because of the support of the Soviets, there was no place for nuclear escalation or even the threat of nuclear escalation, so South Korea was going to have to be defended with conventional weapons if it was going to be defended at all. And these were weapons that the United States found it had in very short supply. So we'll talk more about the actual conduct of the Korean War in the next episode in this series, because there's an awful lot of interesting things to talk about there. For now, though, let's talk about the actual weapons, at least in the form of aircraft, that the United States Air Force and Navy had on hand with which to prosecute the Korean War. It's an interesting mix because the Korean War came at an interesting moment, as military aviation was switching over from propeller-driven aircraft of World War II to modern jets that would predominate by the time of Vietnam. In the Korean War, though, the duties were shared about equally between prop planes and jets. So let's start with the Air Force, as its prop-driven aircraft were arguably the most venerable in the stocks, because unlike the Navy, they hadn't been developing their propeller-driven aircraft, and pretty soon after the war, they stopped buying them at all. So basically, as far as tactical air power, the United States Air Force was left with, literally, war surplus stocks of P-51 single-engine fighters, renamed the F-51, but still the same D model that had flown over Germany. They also had the A-26 Invader twin-engined attack bomber, which had also, helpfully, been renamed the B-26 so that it could forever be confused with the B-26 Marauder twin-engine bomber from World War II. As I said, these aircraft were literally the same aircraft that had been flying on VJ Day, or shortly thereafter, having been afforded no upgrades whatsoever. And you might wonder why. For tactical air power, the Air Force was using the Mustang, since the P-51, while being the premier escort fighter of World War II, was nowhere near as good a fighter-bomber as the P-47, or for that matter, the P-38. Well, that, dear listener, is because the F-51s had been retained because they were supposed to be air superiority fighters, not fighter-bombers. Effectively, they'd been transferred to air reserve squadrons who mainly focused on practicing bomber intercept missions with them. Now, in addition to the F-51, there was one new prop-based aircraft in the Air Force inventory, and this was the F-82, a truly odd bird, if there ever was one. This was the twin Mustang, which was basically two P-51s joined together with a short center wing section and an elevator joining the two vertical stabilizers. Now, why on earth would anyone invent such a thing, you ask? Well, that's because the F-82 could fly higher, faster, and farther than the F-51, thus making it, you guessed it, a better interceptor. So basically, the Air Force really had no tactical air power available, and they would have to adapt what they had on the fly, so to speak. Okay, that covers the main U.S. Air Force prop-driven aircraft. Now, the United States Navy also operated a significant number of propeller-driven aircraft. In fact, they were actually a little bit later to the jet party than the Air Force had been, so most of the carrier air wings were still only 40% jet-powered in 1950. The two principal naval aircraft, prop-driven naval aircraft, were the F-4U Corsair and the AD-1, well, eventually AD-2, 3, and 4, Skyraider. Now, unlike the Air Force, the Navy had continued to develop propeller-driven aircraft after the war. This was partly because they were slow to find and acquire a jet that could operate from a carrier, but also partly because the Navy, and particularly the Marines, remember them? The only one of the U.S. Air Forces that actually made close air support a focus for being? Well, we'll get back to them in the next episode, believe me. At any rate, with the Marines advocating for ground attack capability on board carriers, the Navy had continued to develop prop-based aviation and attack assets. They had actually worked their way through two successors to the F-6F Hellcat in the form of the F-7F Tigercat and the F-8F Bearcat. But these had mostly been retired by the start of the Korean War, although a few twin-engined F-7Fs were retained as night fighters, and they would see combat in Korea. Those aircraft had been retired because they were air superiority aircraft, and that role had been handed to the new F-9F Panther jet. The Navy had retained the Corsair, specifically because it was a better fast-attack fighter bomber than either of the Hellcat's successors. By the time of Korea, all of the Navy Corsairs had been upgraded to the F-4U-5 configuration, which had arrived a little after the end of the war. It featured a significantly more powerful engine than the version that served in the war, but which only had a single-stage supercharger since it was not intended to operate at high altitudes. It also had its 50 cal machine guns replaced with 20mm cannon, while 6 50 cals were replaced by 4 20mm cannon, which of course were better for ground attack. The F-4U-5 could carry up to 4,000 bombs, although it didn't usually carry that much, on 3 hardpoints. It could also carry 5-inch HFAR rockets. Now, in addition to the fighter bomber role filled by the Corsair, the Navy had also invested in a new prop-based design to act as a dedicated attack bomber, and this was the AD-1 Skyraider, about which, dear listener, we will speak more, particularly if the DCF version ever eventually appears. The AD-1 was, effectively, the result of taking the Navy's experience with the SBD Dauntless, the SB-2C Helldiver, and the TBM Avenger, and creating the ultimate propeller-driven bomb truck that was designed purely and simply to tote as much hurt as possible and dump it on the enemy with as close to pinpoint accuracy as possible. Pretty it was not. Deadly it was. Possessed eventually of 4 20mm cannon and of no fewer than 15 hardpoints upon which could be hung 8,000 pounds of ordnance, hauled aloft by a 2,700 horsepower Wright R3350 engine, the same engine that powered the mighty B-29, by the way. The A-1, and to some extent the obsolete Navy propeller fighters, truly represented the pinnacle of reciprocating piston-engined aircraft design. They were the result not only of 3 decades of experience, but also a colossal amount of energy and innovation that had gone into squeezing every last drop of performance out of the standard warbird pattern of a huge engine tail dragger with straight wings and tail. The controls were operated fully manually, and the entire instrument suite was operated by mechanical means or by vacuum. By 1950, they were rapidly becoming an anachronism, but they weren't quite there yet, because the new generation of jets was only barely ready for prime time. Now, the jet engine had actually been around since the late 1930s, but a fully practical design didn't appear until the end of the Second World War. Everyone is familiar, of course, with the Me-262, which saw active service with the Luftwaffe, but the first military jet to fly was actually the British Gloucester Meteor, which actually flew in March of 1943. Only the concentration on delivering existing aircraft rather than developing new ones really kept the Meteor from reaching the front lines early enough to have much operational history in the war. All of which is to say that the Allies were not far behind the Germans when it came to jet technology, and the first operational military jets began to appear almost immediately after the end of the war. In contrast to the big warbirds, with which the aerospace design and engineering community was very familiar, the first jets were something brand new. And although a lot of effort was going into understanding the new technology, and it was advancing very rapidly, these first designs really just consisted of replacing the big reciprocating engine in the front of the plane with a more powerful and more streamlined jet engine at the back, which then meant the tail wheel had to move to the front, so tricycle gear became the norm for jets. But the designs were still very much straight wings, square empennage, a basic form. These included the Air Force P-80 Shooting Star, the first operational U.S. military jet, which had been joined by the F-84 Thunderjet, and very, very recently, by the time of the Korean War, by the F-86 Sabre, which was really the first second-generation jet. The U.S. Navy was operating the F-9F Panther and the F-2H Banshee. All of these first-generation jets had basically been designed by engineers who knew almost nothing about the world of transonic aerodynamics. And so, while they were much faster than the fastest piston engine fighters, their top speeds were seriously limited by their relatively low maximum Mach numbers. So they really were not getting the most out of those new power plants at the upper end. The other issue that they universally suffered from was that the first turbojet engines used a ridiculous amount of fuel compared to piston engines, and unlike piston engines, there was no way to increase fuel economy in flight. So those first jets all had very short operational ranges, which is why you see almost all of them universally with wingtip tanks. But the short range also combined with another limitation to pose a significant issue for jets as tactical aircraft. The fact was that jets took a lot longer to get up to takeoff speed because their jet engines took longer to develop power than props did. Those jet engines were also a lot more sensitive to dirt, crap, and debris being sucked into the engine. And finally, the tricycle plan landing gear was not really suitable for soft feels, as the nose wheel tended to dig in and cause, well, general unhappiness. All of which is to say that the jets were not really suited to operating from sort of primitive or improvised airfields near the front lines. They needed long, hard runways that could only be found at well-established air bases, which in Korea tended to be in Japan, or at sea on a carrier. And that need to be based remotely, combined with their inherently short legs, would cause some significant issues during the Korean conflict. Okay, I think that we have covered the interwar years in sufficient detail now to understand exactly how the mighty had fallen from where U.S. air power was in 1945 to where it found itself in 1950. In the next episode in this series, we will start looking at the Korean War in earnest. I hope you're enjoying these videos. If you are, please subscribe to the channel and by all means like the videos. Leaving a comment on the videos is also very helpful, and if you'd like, dropping by the Discord channel to continuing the discussion would very much be appreciated as well. But for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.